First Seminole War began in the summer of 1816, when Brigadier General Edmund P. Gaines launched an expedition into Seminole territory at the head of about 100 US regulars and 150 Allied Creek warriors, with their initial goal being the conquest of Negro Fort. The Black Warriors rose bravely up to the challenge, flying a red flag above their walls, indicating that they would give no quarter. Despite their brave struggle, a US gunboat positioned on the nearby Apalachicola River struck the fort's main gunpowder magazine, triggering a massive explosion that killed almost all 330 of the defenders. Utterly enraged African and Amerindian Seminoles retaliated with aggressive raids on American border towns in Georgia. Meanwhile, Gaines's expedition continued westwards, attacking and destroying a Seminole settlement known as Foultown in November of 1817. Retaliating in force, Seminole warriors under one chief Homathlimiko ambushed a US Navy boat on the Apalachicola River. 40 American citizens, including women and children, were gruesomely tortured and executed. This massacre sparked outrage in Washington, and as a result, Andrew Jackson was sent to quell the growing Indian problem. At the head of 500 Army regulars, 1,000 Dixieland militiamen, and 2,000 Creek warriors, Jackson launched a renewed punitive strike into Seminole lands. His first move was to build a new outpost, Fort Gadsden. He then proceeded deep into native territory, leaving a path of fire in his wake. The Seminoles offered fierce resistance, but were simply outnumbered and outgunned. After a brief detour to seize the Spanish-held Fort San Marcos as a base of operations, Jackson managed to lure 2 Seminole chieftains onto a ship flying fake British colours. They were executed without trial, along with 2 British traders who had been selling them weapons. After this, Jackson proceeded down the Suwannee River, burning every major settlement along its shores. All organized resistance was soon stamped out, and the Seminoles were forced to abandon northern Florida. Dispersing into the central and southern swamplands, Jackson declared victory and sent most of his army back to their homes, ending the First Seminole War. Jackson's escapades had angered Britain, whose citizens he'd executed, and Spain, who technically still owned Florida. In 1819, Spain gloomily accepted the inevitable and just sold Florida to Washington for $5 million. The Americans were now free to ramp up their war efforts against the Seminoles. Recognizing this, most Seminole chieftains sued for peace in 1823, signing the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which shrunk their territory down to a reservation in the inland swamps of central Florida. However, as Seminoles continued to treat white settlers with bitterness and continued to harbor escaped slaves, tensions grew once more. In 1830, Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. One of his first initiatives was to get Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, a piece of legislation that mandated the expulsion of all Native Americans in the eastern United States to a designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, a policy that would lead to the infamous Trail of Tears. The plan was to move the Seminoles out to Arkansas Territory, where they would be settled in the same reservation as the Creeks, since the US government did not see a difference between the two tribes. Naturally, the overwhelming majority of Seminoles were deeply opposed to not only having to leave their homes, but having to live with their ancestral Creek enemies. When 7 Seminole chieftains were invited out to Arkansas to survey their prospective new lands in 1832, the majority of them declared that they would keep their people in Florida. However, 2 chieftains did submit and signed the Treaty of Fort Payne. Operating in utter bad faith, US officials claimed that per this treaty, all Seminoles were now bound to move west, despite the majority of them having never agreed to do so. The Senate ratified the document in 1834, giving the Seminoles an ultimatum to vacate Florida within the year or be removed by force. One Seminole leader particularly enraged by this was a chieftain named Osceola, who quickly began rallying other chieftains in preparation for the battles to come. Osceola was a fascinating man. He had actually formed a dysfunctional friendship with one Wiley Thompson, the US federal agent who had been put in charge of deporting Osceola's people. At one point, Thompson had even given Osceola a rifle as a sign of respect, even though it was against US policy to arm Indians. This was a fatal misjudgment of character, for on December 28, 1835, the Seminole chieftain assassinated Thompson outside Fort King using that very same gun. Later that night, a column of 110 US soldiers, led by Major Francis L. Dade, was ambushed by a Seminole raiding party led by Chiefs McCanopy and Jumper. All but 2 of them were massacred. The Second Seminole War had begun.